The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a Friday afternoon. People rushing to gates, announcements blaring overhead, and the constant hum of rolling suitcases against tile floors. Among the crowd walked an older woman, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, clutching both her boarding pass and a cardboard tube under her arm like it contained something precious. Beth Miller had been dreading this trip for weeks. At 68, she didn't fly much anymore. The hassle of security lines and cramped seats had lost its appeal years ago. But some journeys couldn't be avoided, no matter how much she wished they could. "Next, please," called the gate agent, barely looking up from her computer. Beth handed over her boarding pass, trying to ignore the slight tremble in her fingers. "I'm in 23B, she said, mostly to herself. The gate agent scanned the document and nodded. "You're all set, ma'am. We're boarding Group 4 now, so you can go right ahead." Beth thanked her quietly and stepped onto the jet bridge, joining the slow shuffle toward the plane. The cardboard tube bumped awkwardly against other passengers as she tried to keep it from being crushed. "Need help with that?" asked a businessman in a hurry, more annoyed than helpful. "No, thank you," Beth replied. "I've got it." She'd carried this particular burden for 30 years. A few more hours wouldn't make any difference. The flight attendant at the door greeted her with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard. 23B is about halfway down on your right." Beth nodded and made her way down the narrow aisle, apologizing as the cardboard tube knocked against seatbacks. By the time she reached row 23, she was already exhausted, both physically and emotionally. A large man occupied the window seat, already spilling slightly into her assigned middle spot. On the aisle sat a mother trying to manage a squirming toddler. Beth's heart sank. 3.5 hours like this would be unbearable. As she struggled to lift her small carry-on into the overhead bin, a flight attendant appeared beside her. "Here, let me help you with that," she offered, effortlessly tucking the bag away. Her name tag read, Diane. "Thank you," Beth said, still clutching the tube. Diane glanced at the crowded row, then back at Beth's worried face. After a quick look at her tablet, she leaned closer. "We're not full today. Would you prefer a window seat toward the back? It might be more comfortable." The relief must have shown clearly on Beth's face. "That would be wonderful." "Follow me," Diane said with a genuine smile, leading Beth further back. "How about 12F? It's a window, and nobody's in the middle seat." Beth settled into her new spot gratefully. "You're an angel," she told Diane, carefully placing the cardboard tube in the empty seat beside her. "Not a problem at all." "Special cargo?" Diane asked, nodding toward the tube. Beth's fingers tightened around it reflexively. "Just something for my son." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than her words, because Diane's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Well, I hope he appreciates it. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" "Water, please, if it's not too much trouble." As Diane moved away to help other passengers, Beth turned to look out the small oval window. The ground crew rushed around below, loading luggage and preparing for departure. Beth couldn't help wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. It had been nearly 5 years since she'd spoken to her son, Tom. 5 years of birthday cards returned unopened, holidays spent alone, and nights lying awake wondering where she'd gone wrong. And now here she was, flying halfway across the country because of a letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago. The letter hadn't said much. Just that Tom would be participating in some kind of military ceremony this weekend, and that Beth was welcome to attend if she wanted. "No, I miss you. No, I'm sorry." Just an invitation that felt more like an obligation than a reconciliation. Yet she'd bought the ticket the same day. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing their flight time to San Diego would be 3 hours and 20 minutes. Beth barely heard him. Her mind was 30 years in the past, in a small-town classroom near Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. The plane began to push back from the gate, and Beth closed her eyes. She'd been teaching 4th grade then, with a classroom full of military kids whose parents would deploy for months at a time. One boy in particular, quiet, artistic Kyle, had lost his father in a training accident early in the school year. While the other children drew bright pictures of their families, Kyle filled page after page with fighter jets. Always the same model, always with the same tail number, always coming home safely. Beth had spent lunch breaks and after-school hours helping him create something special for the upcoming air show at the base. Together, they'd researched symbols meaningful to pilots, Things about protection, safe return, and honoring the fallen. The project had changed everything for Kyle, giving him a way to process his grief through art. It had changed everything for Beth, too. The plane rumbled down the runway and lifted into the air. Beth opened her eyes to watch the ground fall away below, houses and cars becoming tiny specks. That classroom project had led her to specialize in helping children process trauma through art therapy. She'd spent the next 25 years of her career developing programs used in schools across the country, but her own son had never understood. Tom had grown up hearing stories about her kids at school. He'd watched her stay late making materials, spend weekends at workshops, and pour her heart into other people's children. By the time he was a teenager, his resentment had hardened into something ugly. Their relationship had fractured completely when he'd announced he was joining the Air Force. Beth, who'd seen firsthand the toll military life took on families, had reacted badly. Words were said that couldn't be unsaid. He'd left for basic training without saying goodbye. Now he was a career officer, and she was a retired teacher flying to a ceremony she knew nothing about, carrying a recreation of Kyle's sign as a peace offering. The seatbelt light dinged off, and Diane appeared with Beth's water. "Thank you," Beth said, taking a small sip. "Do you know if we'll be flying near any military training areas today?" Diane looked surprised by the question. "I don't think so, but I can check with the captain if you'd like." "No, that's all right. I was just curious." As Diane moved on, Beth carefully pulled the tube onto her lap and loosened the cap. She hadn't looked at the sign since finishing it 3 days ago. Part of her was afraid she'd gotten the symbols wrong after all these years. She slid the rolled paper partway out, just enough to confirm it was intact. The bold lines and colors looked right, at least as far as she could remember. She'd had to work from memory and a few faded photographs, but she thought she'd captured the essence of what she and Kyle had created so long ago. Beth tucked the sign back into its tube, secured the cap, and leaned her head against the window. Outside, the landscape had given way to clouds that looked like cotton batting stretched across the sky. She had no idea if this gesture would mean anything to Tom. Maybe he'd see it as just another example of her caring more about a former student than her own son. Maybe he wouldn't even show up to meet her. The letter had been vague enough that she couldn't be sure he actually wanted her there, but she had to try. After 68 years, Beth had learned that regret was a much heavier burden than rejection. Even if Tom turned her away again, at least she would know she'd done everything possible to repair what was broken between them. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and Beth felt herself growing drowsy. She hadn't slept well the night before, too anxious about the journey ahead. As her eyes drifted closed, she wondered what Kyle would think if he knew his childhood art project might help heal another family all these years later. In her dreams, fighter jets soared across blue skies, their contrails writing messages of forgiveness in the air. And in seat 12F, Beth slept, unaware that in a few hours everything would change. Beth woke with a start when the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. For a moment she was disoriented, her mind still caught between dreams and reality. The cardboard tube had slipped from her grasp during her nap, and now lay across the empty middle seat. She quickly retrieved it, checking that the cap was still secure. "Can I get you anything?" Diane asked, pausing beside Beth's row. "We'll be serving drinks and snacks shortly." "Just water again, please," Beth replied, still feeling groggy. "How much longer until we land?" "About 2 hours," Diane said with a smile. "You slept for quite a while." As the flight attendant moved on, Beth turned her attention back to the window. The endless blue sky reminded her of another spring day. 30 years earlier, when everything had changed. It had been April, 1995. Beth had been teaching 4th grade for nearly a decade by then, mostly children from military families. The school sat just outside Peterson Air Force Base, and the sound of aircraft taking off and landing was as common as the school bell. That year, her class included 10-year-old Kyle Reynolds, whose father, Captain David Reynolds, had died 3 months earlier when his F-16 crashed during a night training exercise. The boy had withdrawn almost completely after the funeral, barely speaking to anyone and turning in blank assignments. Beth had tried everything to reach him: parent conferences with his overwhelmed mother, sessions with the school counselor, modified assignments, but nothing seemed to help. Until the day she'd brought in a guest speaker, a retired. The boy had agreed immediately, and they'd spent the next 3 weeks researching pilot traditions after school. Kyle had been particularly fascinated by the symbols used on mission patches and aircraft nose art: eagles for freedom, stars for fallen pilots, certain arrangements of clouds for protection. Together, they'd created a large banner incorporating these symbols, along with a message written partly in pilot slang and shorthand that only aviators would fully understand. At the air show, they'd been given permission to display it in the memorial area. Beth smiled at the memory of Kyle's face when 3 pilots had approached them at the show, deeply moved by the banner. They'd explained that the arrangement of symbols Kyle had, intuitively created, actually held special meaning in their community, a specific configuration that was sometimes used as an unofficial tribute to pilots lost during training missions. One of the pilots, a lieutenant colonel, had knelt down to Kyle's level. "Your dad would be incredibly proud of this," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. "Did someone help you with these symbols?" Kyle had shaken his head. "I just drew what I saw in my dreams. When Dad comes back to fly me to the stars." The pilots had exchanged looks Beth couldn't interpret, then asked if they could take photos of the banner. Later that day, during the flying demonstration, the formation of F-16s had performed an unscheduled missing man formation, a aerial salute to fallen comrades, directly over where Beth and Kyle stood. The airshow coordinator had later told Beth that the pilots had requested the special maneuver, specifically because of Kyle's banner. That project had changed everything. Kyle had slowly emerged from his grief, finding comfort in creating art that connected him to his father's world. And Beth had discovered her true calling, using art to help children process trauma. She'd gone back to school for additional certification in art therapy, eventually developing a program specifically for military children coping with deployment or loss. The Sky Feelings program had been adopted by schools on bases across the country. Beth sighed, watching clouds drift past the airplane window. Her work had helped hundreds of children over the years, but it had cost her the relationship with her own son. Tom had been just 12 when the Kyle project happened, already feeling neglected by his teacher mother, who seemed to care more about other people's kids than her own. As Beth had become more invested in her program, spending evenings and weekends on research and materials, Tom had grown increasingly resentful. When he'd hit his teenage years, the arguments had become constant. "You've got time for every military brat with a sad story, but you can't make it to my baseball games," he'd shouted during one particularly painful fight. Beth had tried to explain that her work was important, that she was helping children who were suffering. But to a 16-year-old boy who just wanted his mom's attention, those explanations had sounded like excuses. The final breaking point had come during Tom's senior year of high school. Beth had been scheduled to present her program at an education conference the same weekend as Tom's state championship baseball game. She'd tried to change her presentation time, but the organizers couldn't accommodate her. "It's fine," Tom had said with cold indifference. "I'm used to it." Beth had gone to the conference telling herself Tom understood the importance of her work. His team had won the championship. Beth had called to congratulate him, but the conversation had been short and strained. 2 months later, Tom had announced he was enlisting in the Air Force immediately after graduation. The irony hadn't been lost on Beth. Her son was choosing to join the very institution that had indirectly come between them. Her reaction had been immediate and visceral. "After everything I've seen those children go through, the deployments, the moves, the losses, how could you choose that life?" "At least they appreciate me there," Tom had shot back. "At least I'll be part of something that matters." He'd left for basic training without resolving things between them. For the first few years, they'd maintained minimal contact, stiff phone calls on holidays, the occasional email. Tom had been stationed in Germany, then South Korea, then various bases around the U.S. Each move had created more distance, not just physically, but emotionally. The last real conversation they'd had was 5 years ago. Tom had called to tell her he'd been selected for a special training program, something he couldn't say much about except that it involved advanced fighter jets. "That's your world now, isn't it?" Beth had said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "The world that took Kyle's father." Tom's voice had gone cold. "Kyle again. Always Kyle and all the other kids. Never me." He hadn't called again after that. Beth had sent cards for his birthday and Christmas, but they'd been returned unopened. She'd tried emailing a few times but received no response. Eventually, she'd stopped trying, until the letter had arrived 3 weeks ago. The turbulence increased, jolting Beth back to the present. The seatbelt sign dinged on and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we're hitting some rough air, so I'm turning on the seatbelt sign. Flight attendants, please take your seats. We're also dealing with a minor mechanical issue that's going to require us to alter our course slightly. Nothing to worry about. But we'll be coordinating with air traffic control for a new approach into San Diego." Beth tightened her seatbelt and clutched the cardboard tube to her chest. Inside was her recreation of Kyle's banner, painstakingly reproduced from old photos and memory. She'd spent weeks on it, using the same symbols and arrangements, though she couldn't remember all the pilot shorthand they'd incorporated. Would Tom even understand what it meant? Would he care about the story behind it? Beth didn't know, but she'd run out of other ideas for bridging the gap between them. The plane banked to the right, changing course. Beth looked out the window as they began to descend through a layer of clouds. What would she say to Tom if she saw him? How could she possibly explain that her work with children like Kyle hadn't meant she loved her own son any less? For the first time, Beth wondered if bringing the banner was a mistake. Maybe it would just remind Tom of all the times she'd chosen other children over him. Maybe some wounds were too deep to heal. The plane continued its new course, leaving Beth alone with her doubts, the precious cardboard tube resting in her lap, and the vast sky outside her window growing steadily closer. The plane jerked again, harder this time. A few passengers gasped. Beth gripped her armrests, the cardboard tube now wedged securely between her hip and the wall of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice returned, sounding deliberately calm. "We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence due to our altered flight path. Nothing to be concerned about, but please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Beth glanced out the window. They were flying lower now beneath the cloud cover. In the distance, she could see mountains rising from the desert landscape. This didn't look like the approach to San Diego she remembered from previous trips. A young man across the aisle caught her eye. "Military pilot," he explained, noticing her worried expression. "They're taking us inland a bit, probably avoiding weather along the coast." "Thank you," Beth said, feeling somewhat reassured. "Have you flown this route before?" He nodded, "Many times. My wife's stationed at Miramar. I fly out to see her whenever I can get leave." He gestured to his uniform. "Navy, she's Marines," Beth smiled. Military family still making it work, despite the challenges. She wanted to ask more, but the plane dipped suddenly, ending their conversation as the man braced himself against the seat in front. Diane's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we'll be continuing through some rough air for a few minutes. Please make sure all loose items are secured." Beth looked down at the cardboard tube and hugged it closer. Inside was her last hope for reconciliation with her son. The thought of losing it now was unbearable. She turned back to the window, trying to distract herself from the turbulence. The landscape below was changing. Less mountain now, more flat desert with occasional signs of human habitation. In the far distance, she could make out what looked like a large airfield. Her mind drifted back to Tom. He would be 38 now. A career military man. The letter she'd received had been printed on Air Force stationery, but it hadn't mentioned his rank or current assignment. Just that there was a ceremony, and she was welcome to attend. Beth had spent hours online trying to figure out what kind of ceremony it might be. A promotion? A change of command? Retirement seemed unlikely at his age. She'd found nothing specific, just general information about Air Force traditions. What she had discovered, somewhat by accident, was that Miramar, once a naval air station, was now a Marine Corps air base that still hosted some Air Force operations. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Whatever ceremony Tom was participating in, it was likely happening at Miramar. The plane continued to bounce through rough air. Beth closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. Flying had never been her favorite activity, and the turbulence wasn't helping her anxiety about seeing Tom again. Mom used to be afraid of flying. The memory of Tom's voice, young Tom, maybe 8 years old, surfaced unexpectedly. He'd been talking to a friend, explaining why Beth always brought a specific book on planes. But she read that pilots have special training for problems, so now she just trusts them to do their jobs. Beth hadn't realized he'd been paying attention to her small rituals. That he'd noticed her fear, and how she'd worked to overcome it. Had she really been so terrible a mother? She'd attended school plays and parent-teacher conferences. She'd made his favorite dinners and helped with homework. Yes, her work had taken time away from him, especially after the Kyle project took off. But she'd loved Tom fiercely, had wanted the best for him. The plane dipped again, then steadied. Beth opened her eyes and gasped. Outside her window, no more than a few hundred yards away, flew an F-22 Raptor fighter jet. Its sleek form was unmistakable, the twin tails and angular wings unlike any commercial aircraft. Behind it flew a second F-22 maintaining perfect formation. Beth pressed her face closer to the window in disbelief. The fighter jets were flying parallel to their commercial plane, close enough that she could make out details of their gray paint schemes and markings. "Oh my goodness," said a voice from across the aisle. The military man had noticed too. That's rare to see them this close to a civilian aircraft. All around the plane, passengers were pointing and pressing their faces to windows. Someone a few rows ahead shouted excitedly about Top Gun fighters, though Beth knew that wasn't quite right. The F-22s maintained their position alongside the airliner for nearly a minute. Beth couldn't take her eyes off them. There was something almost graceful about the way they held formation, powerful engines allowing them to match the much slower commercial plane's speed with apparent ease. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, both fighter jets banked away, climbing rapidly. They disappeared from view above the plane. "Wow," exclaimed a child somewhere behind Beth. "Did you see that, Mom?" Beth continued staring out the window, her heart racing. F-22 Raptors were among the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. What were they doing flying so close to a commercial flight? The plane banked again, beginning what felt like a wide, circular pattern. The captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed by air traffic control to hold in a waiting pattern temporarily. We're told there's a military exercise taking place that we need to give some room to. We expect this delay to be brief, maybe 15 minutes or so. Flight attendants will remain seated during this time." Beth's mind was racing. A military exercise? The F-22s? She looked out the window again, scanning the sky for any sign of the fighter jets. The empty middle seat beside her suddenly felt like an opportunity. With slightly trembling fingers, Beth uncapped the cardboard tube and carefully slid out the rolled paper inside. She hadn't planned to unfurl it until she was safely on the ground, but something told her this might be important. The banner she'd recreated was about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. She'd used fabric markers on white canvas just as she and Kyle had done 30 years ago. The background was a deep blue like the sky, with carefully drawn symbols arranged in a specific pattern, eagles and stars, cloud formations and geometric shapes that held special meaning to military pilots. Across the bottom, in a mixture of standard English and pilot shorthand, ran the message they'd crafted. "Clear skies await beyond the clouds. Fly high. Return safe. Remember always." Beth stared at the banner in her lap, memories flooding back. The day at the air show when the pilots had recognized the symbols. The missing man formation they'd flown in honor of Kyle's father. The way that simple art project had changed the course of her career and inadvertently damaged her relationship with her son. On impulse, Beth raised the banner to the window, pressing it flat against the plexiglass. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to do this. Perhaps just to see it in the natural light, or to hold it up to the sky where it belonged. The plane continued its circular holding pattern, banking slightly to the left. Beth kept the banner pressed against the window, adjusting it as sunlight streamed in. Suddenly, the F-22s reappeared. They approached from behind the airliner, moving into position alongside it once more. Beth's window was on the correct side of the plane to see them clearly, and she found herself staring directly at the nearest fighter jet, her banner displayed between them. Time seemed to slow down. The F-22 was close enough that Beth could make out the helmet of the pilot, the canopy reflecting sunlight. For a breathtaking moment, it felt like the pilot was looking directly at her, at the banner pressed against her window. Then something extraordinary happened. The F-22 dipped its wing slightly toward the commercial plane, a subtle movement but unmistakably deliberate. A greeting. An acknowledgement. Beth's heart nearly stopped. She pressed the banner more firmly against the window, her hands shaking with sudden, overwhelming emotion. The second F-22 shifted position, moving up and ahead of the first. The lead aircraft lifted away, climbing sharply. The remaining jet held position for a moment longer. then rolled gracefully and followed its wingman upward. As they climbed, the two jets separated, creating a gap between them, a gap where a third aircraft would normally fly in formation, the missing man formation, the aerial salute to fallen comrades. Beth's vision blurred with tears. It couldn't be coincidence. Somehow the pilots had recognized the symbols on her banner, the same arrangement that had moved their predecessors to action 30 years ago. Around her, passengers were exclaiming in delight at the aerial display, many recording with their phones, but none of them understood what they were witnessing. None of them knew the significance of that empty space in the sky, none except Beth, watching through tears as the fighters disappeared into the blue, her banner still pressed against the window, and her heart filled with a wild, impossible hope. For several minutes after the fighter jets disappeared, Beth sat motionless, the banner still pressed against the window. Her mind raced with questions. Had the pilots really recognized the symbols, or was it just a standard part of their exercise? A coincidence that felt meaningful only to her. A soft ding signaled the captain turning off the seatbelt sign. His voice came over the intercom, sounding more relaxed than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared to resume our approach to San Diego. Those fighter jets you saw are part of an Air Force training exercise. Quite a show, wasn't it? We should be on the ground in about 20 minutes. All around the cabin, excited chatter broke out as passengers compared photos and videos they'd captured. Beth carefully rolled up her banner and returned it to its cardboard tube. Her hands were still trembling slightly. The Navy man across the aisle caught her eye again. "That was something special," he said. "F-22s don't usually fly that close to commercial aircraft. Must be some kind of demonstration day." Beth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. How could she explain the significance of what had just happened? That those pilots had seemingly recognized a 30-year-old memorial banner, recreated from memory? Diane appeared beside Beth's seat, her professional demeanor slightly ruffled by the excitement. "Are you all right, ma'am? You're looking a bit pale." "I'm fine," Beth assured her. "Just..." Surprised by the fighter jets, Diane smiled. That was quite unusual. "The captain says they radioed him directly after they flew past. Something about thanking us for the airspace courtesy." She glanced at the cardboard tube now clutched in Beth's lap. "Were you holding something up to the window when they flew by?" Beth hesitated, then nodded. "An old banner. It has special meaning to Air Force pilots." Something in Beth's tone must have signaled that she didn't want to elaborate, because Diane simply patted her shoulder. "Well, whatever it was, it made for an exciting flight. Can I get you anything before we land?" Beth shook her head, and Diane moved on to check on other passengers. Outside the window, the landscape was changing again as they descended toward San Diego. Beth could see the coastline now, the Pacific Ocean stretching blue and vast to the horizon. What would happen when they landed? Beth had arranged for a rental car to drive to the base where Tom's ceremony would be held tomorrow. She'd booked a hotel room nearby, but now she wondered if something had changed. Those pilots had seen her banner. What if word somehow reached Tom before she could see him in person? The plane continued its descent, the thump of landing gear being deployed reverberating through the cabin. Beth closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. After 30 years working with children dealing with anxiety, she'd learned a few techniques herself. The wheels touched down with a squeal of rubber on tarmac, and the engines roared as they reversed thrust to slow the plane. Beth opened her eyes as they taxied toward the terminal, watching ground crew in bright vests directing them to their gate. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Diego International Airport," announced the captain. "Local time is 3:42 p.m. and the temperature is a beautiful 74 degrees. Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until we reach the gate, and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." Beth gathered her few belongings, making sure the cardboard tube was secure. As the plane slowly approached the gate, she rehearsed her plan in her mind. Get her carry-on from the overhead bin, exit the plane, find the rental car counter. Beth's heart began to race. What message? He said, "Tell her the shield still flies. Guardians, remember?" The captain shrugged slightly. "I have no idea what that means, but he seemed to think it was important." Beth's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. The shield. That was what the pilots at the air show 30 years ago had called the arrangement of symbols Kyle had created. They'd said it looked like a protective shield for aviators. And guardians was a term sometimes used for pilots of certain squadrons. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Captain Wilson asked, concerned by her emotional response. Beth nodded, wiping away tears. Yes, sorry, that message. It means a great deal to me. Thank you for passing it along. The captain smiled. Well, there's more. When we landed, I received a call from the tower. There are some Air Force personnel waiting to meet you at the gate. They specifically asked for the passenger in 12F with the banner. Beth stared at him in shock. Waiting for me? But how would they? Military moves quickly when it wants to, Captain Wilson said with a slight smile. Whatever that banner means, it seems to be important to them. They've arranged an escort for you. Beth's mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. How had a simple gesture, holding up the banner to her window, set all this in motion? And what did it mean for her plans to see Tom tomorrow? You don't have to go with them if you don't want to, the captain added, noticing her hesitation. I can have security escort you through another exit. Beth took a deep breath, steadying herself. No, if they want to talk to me about the banner, I'll meet with them. After all, this was why she'd come, to bridge the gap between her world and the military world that had claimed her son. Captain Wilson nodded. They're waiting at the jet bridge door. Take your time gathering your things. As he returned to the cockpit, Beth stood on slightly shaky legs and retrieved her small carry-on from the overhead bin. She checked to make sure the cardboard tube was securely capped, then slung her purse over her shoulder. Diane appeared with a sympathetic smile. Ready, Mrs. Miller? Beth nodded, though she didn't feel ready at all. She followed Diane to the front of the plane, pausing at the door that led to the jet bridge. Through the small window, she could see 2 Air Force officers in blue uniforms waiting just beyond. Whatever it is, Diane said quietly. I'm sure it will be fine. You didn't do anything wrong. Beth gave her a grateful smile. Thank you for everything. You've been very kind. Taking one more deep breath, Beth stepped through the door and into the jet bridge. The 2 officers straightened as she appeared. One was a woman, perhaps in her mid-30s, with her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. The other was an older man with graying hair at his temples and the silver eagle insignia of a colonel on his shoulders. Mrs. Elizabeth Miller, the woman asked, stepping forward. Beth nodded, clutching the cardboard tube like a lifeline. Yes, that's me. The colonel stepped forward and surprised Beth by extending his hand warmly. Mrs. Miller, I'm Colonel James Peterson. This is Captain Lisa Chen. Thank you for waiting to speak with us. Beth shook his hand, confused by the friendly greeting. Of course, but I don't understand what this is about. Colonel Peterson glanced at the cardboard tube. Is that the banner you displayed from the aircraft window? Yes, Beth confirmed. But how did you know about it so quickly? And why is it important? The colonel and captain exchanged looks. That's a longer conversation, Colonel Peterson said. One better had in private. We've arranged transport to take you where you need to go. Would you be willing to come with us? I promise everything will be explained. Beth hesitated. This was all happening so fast, so far from what she'd planned. But something told her this was important, that somehow the banner had created an opportunity she hadn't foreseen. Would this have anything to do with Lieutenant Thomas Miller? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The surprise that flickered across both officers' faces told Beth everything she needed to know. You know Lieutenant Miller? Captain Chen asked carefully. Beth nodded, her grip tightening on the cardboard tube. He's my son.